Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend it with us and learn a little bit about one of our programs that we've been involved with since the mid to late 2000s. But a little bit before we get to that is just so everybody knows, I'm Rusty Lloyd. I'm the Executive Director of River's Edge West. Our organization is a small, medium nonprofit located here in Grand Junction, and our mission is really to advance riparian restoration through education, collaboration, and technical assistance. So we have a wide variety of programs that we do, and partnerships that we support, educational programs. And today you're going to hear about one of those that we've been involved with for about a little over a decade now. You're going to hear from one of the our restoration coordinator, Rica Fulton, who's a lead on the Dolores River Restoration Partnership and works with collaborating with many agencies and other NGOs and local, state, and federal entities to really enact what we do on the Dolores River Restoration Partnership. So again, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you being with us today. This is our fourth installment of our webinar series, and we'll continue to have those probably through the indefinite future, so we can continue to get out information and programs and science and information into people's hands. So, well, without further ado, I am going to turn it over. I'd like to introduce Rica Fulton, River's Edge West Restoration Coordinator and one of the leads on the Dolores River Restoration Partnership. I hope you all enjoy, and we'll answer your questions towards the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rusty, and Kara as well for getting this all set up. First thing, you guys can all see my screen. As Rusty said, my name is Rica Fulton, and I've been working at River's Edge West for a little over a year now, and I coordinate the Dolores River Restoration Partnership as well as the Desert Rivers Collaborative, which is centered here in the Grand Valley along the Colorado and Gunnison Rivers. So before I start, I really want to say thanks to especially Emily Cassian, who's the co-coordinator of the Dolores Partnership. She works with Southwest Conservation Corps out of Durango, and she really deserves a lot of credit for the status of the monitoring program and where it's at now, and does amazing work with that. And some of the content here was developed by her. So today I wanted to talk about the DRRP and the evolution of the monitoring program over a decade. So monitoring is such a critical component of riparian restoration, and it's also really complex and easy to go down rabbit holes. So I hope some of the lessons learned from the Dolores River Restoration Partnership will provide some things to consider if anyone out there is maybe altering a monitoring program or starting one from scratch, or is just interested in learning about the data that we're collecting. So here's a brief outline about what I'm going to be talking about today. First, I'll give a quick background on the partnership for some folks who may not be aware of our goals or who's involved and what activities have occurred and are occurring still. Then I'll talk about the purpose of vegetation monitoring and why it's such a crucial piece of restoration work. Then I'll talk about the evolution of monitoring throughout the past decade on the Dolores and some changes that have been made along the way. And then I'll talk a little bit about the rapid monitoring program and associated programs as they stand now in the context of how they might be useful for other watershed groups or entities. So the DRRP is a public-private collaborative that was formed in 2009 by a group of nonprofits, the BLM, a handful of other folks who are all concerned about the overwhelming presence of tamarisk along the Dolores River and its tributaries that has been occurring due to increased drought, changing hydrology with the presence of McPhee Dam higher up in the watershed. Massive tamarisk stands really have a lot of negative impacts, including reduced wildlife habitat, minimize river access for wildlife and people alike. Reduction in recreational qualities, it makes it much harder to camp and access the river safely with really dense tamarisk. Lessened water quality, especially in terms of salinity. Tamarisk increases soil and water salinity. Also, many impacts to the physical river channel in terms of channelization. It can also increase the likelihood of wildfire along the river corridor. So one of the first actions the partnership did was develop what is the Dolores River Riparian Action Plan that really lines out priorities, visions, methods, and other factors that go into restoration, which is really this live living document that has been a nice central function for the partnership over the years. So here is a map of the Dolores River Basin for folks who aren't totally aware. I'm sure many on the people of the call are aware of where the Dolores is, but we work between McPhee Reservoir, just below it, and then all the way up to the confluence of the Colorado River in Utah. So it spans through 2 states, 6 counties, 4 BLM field offices, and many, many miles of private lands. So restoration inherently requires a lot of coordination since rivers and tamarisk, don't care who manages the land. It's also fairly remote and hard to access. Also major tributaries are the San Miguel here, which changes the river characteristics quite a bit. I don't think you guys can see my cursor, but kind of up to the right. And then, so that also is an influence. See a lot of changes along the way. So a little bit more about our partners. I feel really grateful to be working with all these folks. They're all really remarkable in terms of their commitment to this project. These are just a few of our partners listed on this side here, but the DRRP is solidified through an MOU or a Memorandum of Understanding with over 20 different entities. And that really includes of course, the BLM, Rivers Edge West, Conservation Legacy, and Southwest Conservation Corps, other youth corps, and nonprofits, as well as counties, municipalities, universities, CMU and Fort Lewis College, and federal and state agencies. And each partner brings, excuse me, unique resources and perspectives to the partnership. And it's an awesome way to get work done and share information and really make sure sustained stewardship occurs. So the partnership is centered on 4 overarching goals: ecological, social, economic, and management. So our ecological goals are encompassed by the idea of increasing the number of acres of sustainable, healthy riparian and floodplain plant communities in the watershed while reducing those dominated by tamarisk and other invasive non-native plant species. So we're really looking for biodiversity, removing monoculture, creating better habitat for birds, wildlife, and aquatic species. It's really more complex than just removing tamarisk for the sake of getting it out of there. The second goal is social. The DRRP strives towards these social goals because people are part of the environment, and therefore education, outreach, and stewardship are immensely important. Social goals are illuminated by volunteer events, which we do with local schools like the Gateway School and Paradox Valley Charter School, and teach them about tamarisk beetle and have them help us plant native plants. We also work with groups like the Wildland Restoration Volunteers out of the Front Range to get some great work done. So that's a fun way to teach people about the Dolores. We also, the Dolores also provides a platform for including, students from CMU, Colorado Mesa University, and Fort Lewis College into different research opportunities along the river. And then there's another side of social goals that encompass public safety in the form of fuel reduction for fires, as well as increasing visibility along highways. Next are economic goals. So restoration, needs a lot of stakeholders in order to be accomplished. So therefore provides a lot of employment opportunities for contractors and youth corps in the Dolores River area, as well as supporting small businesses who sell associated goods like plants or herbicide and things like that. And then just other small businesses that these folks support when they pass through. On this note, there's been some conversations about perhaps using conservation corps in conservation projects to help create jobs in the near future, similar to after the New Deal. So there's a lot to be said about the value of these programs in that sense. Then another angle is also these goals help include improving the effectiveness and financial efficiency of riparian restoration by protecting economic investments. It's pretty easy for ad hoc tamarisk removal projects to not take into account maintenance. So that's another benefit of having this partnership, is we're really able to ensure that sites are stewarded to their full restoration potential. And then finally, management goals. So the DRRP takes into account, facilitating shared resources, more in-depth knowledge of restoration practices, and really, channels for information sharing, uncovering gaps in knowledge. And one example is just through River's Edge West's annual Riparian Restoration Conference, by providing a platform for researchers and practitioners to get together and actually find a space to communicate there. So one specific metric that's directly relevant to monitoring is the partnership's ecological outcomes. So these were decided upon early in the partnership and are listed in the Dolores River Riparian Action Plan that I mentioned earlier. So despite the evolution of monitoring programs, these outcomes have remained the same and really delineate the partnership's criteria of whether or not a site is recovered and informs how we track data. So, we look at each site through this lens of, does it have less than 5% relative tamarisk cover, less than 15% relative non-native invasive cover? And having this metric helps us kind of draw the line, which has been really valuable working across such a large watershed. So I'm just going to breeze through this, but activities specifically have included, tamarisk removal, initial, and then also subsequent retreatments. So on almost 2,000 acres, so huge landscape. We also remove Siberian elm and Russian olive when necessary. There's not a ton of it, luckily, but we try to nip it whenever we come across it. A lot of what we do and what our strike teams are 2-person or 3-person teams from youth corps. They do a lot of noxious weed treatments. So Russian knapweed is a big one, and white top, musk thistle, Canada thistle are all some targeted ones that we try to get out there in the spring and the fall and treat as best we can. We also use some biocontrol methods and work with the insectaries and counties on those efforts as well. And then there are some active revegetation that occurs in sites that are ready in terms of native seed or active planting cottonwoods, box elders, or other shrubs. And then, of course, we do monitoring. So what is rapid monitoring? It's a method of tracking restoration activities and progress on sites that we have treated in the past. And this information really helps inform planning and implementation and decide when sites are sufficiently restored. I'll just quickly talk about the difference of long-term and rapid monitoring, and then discuss how monitoring has evolved within the DRRP within those two types of monitoring. And then I'll really talk quite a bit about our current rapid monitoring protocol and bring up some things to consider. Monitoring is super important for a lot of reasons that I've already touched on, but beyond tracking site health and quantifying vegetation characteristics, it's also really helpful from a grant reporting perspective as well, and really enables you to provide these solid metrics and data to measure these outcomes with and show that you really know that you're putting these resources to the best use because you have this long-term track record of how these sites are currently doing ecologically. So these are just some brief differences between long-term and rapid monitoring. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, and rapid monitoring is definitely a viable method for data collection and uses qualitative and quantitative data and is really useful in getting insight into answering specific research questions. So I'm not going to spend too much time here because there's so many different monitoring programs and protocols out there. But characteristics of long-term, or what's sometimes called research monitoring, generally utilize plots or transect lines. For example, line point intercept is a common method for vegetation monitoring, and it takes into account smaller representative areas of a site and is really replicable over time. It reduces subjectivity when you do it that way and ensures the data is more statistically valid. Cons of this method from a watershed perspective especially are that it's only representative of a portion of a site, and especially in riparian areas there can actually be quite a bit of change in biodiversity fairly close together. So also from a watershed perspective, these small snapshots are not always helpful in informing exactly where resources go and how sites are responding to treatments that occur over a larger area. So rapid monitoring is kind of generalized by using more ocular assessments and simple tools. Like for example, the Dolores monitoring teams use tablets with Ark collector on it, which is an app for data collection, an Esri product. And they're still able to collect, take pictures, use the GPS features, but they can just use it all on that one tool. So this data is generally less granular than long-term data, in that not all species may be tracked, especially at all canopy levels. Like for example, we generally don't really quantify grasses as much as we do woodies. We anecdotally note it and track cheatgrass and things like that, but it's not necessarily really incorporated in the protocol. So some things to consider, this method is a little bit more subjective and that it depends exactly where the crews walk, how well they can identify all their species. But the benefits are that it really helps with management at a larger scale. And we can still really track trends in biodiversity as well. So this is my understanding of the past monitoring from the past decade based on some conversations with Rusty and other partners. So I obviously don't know all the granular details of 10 years ago, but here's kind of a brief outline. So immediately after the partnership was formed in 2009, it was clear that some kind of monitoring was necessary to track how sites are doing and overall watershed health was progressing. So it's all laid out in that Dolores River Riparian Action Plan. And they needed to figure out what treatments were doing well, and really especially wanted to make sure that sites were doing worse or anything like that. So around 2010, the DRRP Science and Monitoring Subcommittee got together and picked 40 sites for long-term monitoring and worked with the subcommittee and contractors, especially at the University of Denver, to develop and implement a protocol. In 2010, watershed-wide monitoring, so a form of long-term or research monitoring, was established and used some line point intercept method on those 41-acre sites. So there were 10 sites in each BLM office, and they really comprehensively measured cover, species richness, and the whole gamut. Cons, though, it seems like it took a long time. So already by 2011, the partnership was actually conducting rapid monitoring and watershed-wide monitoring, so I find that very impressive. But there are years where both of those data sets exist, which is kind of cool to look at both of them. And really in the sense that the watershed wide was using more of a ecological, statistically valid method, where rapid monitoring was really looking at treated areas and how those sites were doing on that sense. And then it appears in 2012, the folks started using plots rather than line point intercept method because it was a lot faster and got comparable results. So that was one change there, and then the rapid monitoring remained relatively the same and was conducted every summer by seasonals or interns. And then as more and more sites were getting scheduled for treatments, it became challenging to scale that effort up using more detailed rapid monitoring and long-term monitoring, not to mention it requires a lot more capacity and funds to support 2 separate monitoring efforts and have someone that is analyzing and interpreting the data on the back end. Like, that takes a ton of time. So in around like 2013, I believe, is when electronic data collection started to occur more frequently, and then 2015, 2016, when Ark Collector was first starting to be used in the field. So really many aspects of the rapid monitoring kind of remained the same in a lot of ways and has become more robust. And some of the components of the long-term watershed-wide monitoring can be seen in the current rapid monitoring assessments. So it's kind of become, the most useful data in the most effective and efficient way, which is not going to be the same for everyone, of course, but I think it's kind of interesting to see the evolution each year making these small tweaks. So, long-term monitoring isn't quite site-specific enough to represent an entire watershed. For example, if there was a really bad drought year or a really bad weed infestation that took over a few sites, that could really skew the data, even if the other sites were actually doing pretty well. So, moral of the story is when work is being done at such a large scale, it's really nice to know what you need to do on a site-by-site basis and in order to continue to steward the area. So here's an example of rapid monitoring sites in 2012. It's kind of cool to see the first sites that were done. The ones towards the south are in the Tres Rios BLM field office, at Big Gypsum and in Little Glen Canyon. And then moving up, some of the first sites to be treated were near the confluence with the San Miguel and in that region in the Uncompahgre field office. And then up in the Moab field office, there's some really great sites up there as well that are doing really well, and it's fun to see those evolve through time as well. And now there's over 300 sites, so it's expanded quite a bit. So stepping back, here's a few major guiding questions that monitoring data can help us answer. Is where should we put management resources? And where are we meeting restoration goals at this landscape scale? So now I'll go into the status of the current monitoring protocol and where we're at there, and talk about a little bit of the data that we collect. So this year there's a 2-person watershed monitoring team that's hired and managed by Emily with Southwest Conservation Corps. And right now they're actually out in the field, and they're accompanied by the DRRP strike team, and they're monitoring a total of 121 sites on BLM and some private lands that have been actively treated or have plans to be treated. So they're monitoring the Grand Junction field office and also sites in Utah between State Line and Fisher Creek. And so all of those were last monitored in 2017. So the idea is that we spend 8 weeks of the summer and have a crew monitor roughly, a third of the sites every year based on the field office. So at the end of this year, Emily will come up with a report that really delineates all of the results and provide that to the correct BLM field office. And we'll utilize that data to come up with an implementation plan for the next couple years. So here's some steps like I broadly broke these down. But first, of course, we need to do training since it's always generally seasonals that don't always come back for a year. But actually, Emily started as a monitoring tech, and now she's leading the whole thing. So it's pretty cool to see people get really engaged and become more involved with the program. But Emily usually takes about a week to go out and train these folks, and they'll learn the protocols and get trained in vegetation identification. And then the rapid assessment is paired with some other data collection, including invasive species inventory, as well as the passive recruitment survey. So they're kind of conducted at the same time, but they're recorded on different polygons or maps within Ark Collector, if that makes sense. So essentially appear in different GIS layers. So we have a monitoring layer, an invasive species inventory layer, passive recruitment point features, and then also 3 photo points for each site. So rapid monitoring is based on determining relative vegetation cover through ocular assessments. So the monitors will walk the whole site, which they vary between like half an acre and 20 acres. They're pretty variable. And then each person will keep track and determine their cover estimates while walking the site, while concurrently doing the invasive species inventories and photo points while they're doing the walkthrough. So after they're done with that, they'll discuss their observations and ultimately come up with a consensus for cover classes, abundant native species, and fill out the attribute table for each site on those Ark Collector tablets. And then like when they're back in service, they can sync the data to Ark Online from those tablets, and we're able to look at that data, whoever has the login for that. So it's pretty slick. And then I'll talk a little bit more about passive recruitment here in a few minutes. So here's just like more specifically the data that's collected. First, the rapid assessment, which has like more than 30 fields, so I'm not going to list them all, but we of course list the site ID, the time, and the date. They collect the 3 most abundant native species, 4 most abundant invasive species, and the relative cover of each, across the whole site. They also look at natural recruitment, which is referring to passive recruitment. And if the site has enough that natural vegetation growing back, then we'll track that. And there's a criteria I'll talk about in just a second. So say if the answer was no, it could be a candidate for potentially getting some active revegetation if that was feasible. They'll track absolute vegetation cover, so just how much vegetation total is on the whole site, and then make additional recruitment notes. So say there's propagation of small cottonwoods going on or some seedlings coming up, they'll make notes of that. Well, also it's really important to track tamarisk resprouts or new growth. So they'll make notes about that to decide if we need to send crews out there. They'll see if cheatgrass, kochia, or Russian thistle is present at a site. And then they also always look for the tamarisk beetle or weevil and make any notes on defoliation. The tamarisk beetle has been pretty much everywhere in the Dolores in the past decade. So almost all of them have some form of defoliation. So they make notes on where that's at. And then also just basic other observations, such as if cattle are on site or have been on site, if there's any signs of grazing, or any wildlife observations, such as bear scat, mountain lion prints, etc. And then, of course, just discuss any logistics, about getting to the site. Okay, so passive recruitment. One of the driving hypotheses of the partnership's work can be tested with this passive vegetation recruitment component. So the hypothesis is if we remove 90 to 100% of select invasive species, the native species will naturally recruit on their own. So we're discovering that we may need to conduct more active revegetation than we previously thought, which has a lot to do with environmental conditions like connectivity to groundwater and floodplains, and then the hydrologic regime that's largely controlled by a dam, as well as a pretty compounding climate change. So that's something to consider. This year we decided to broaden our passive revegetation criteria to also include additional native woody species. So like in the past, we had just been tracking cottonwoods and willows, and this year we've had the monitoring crew keep an eye out also for other woodies like New Mexico privet, box elders, and three-leaf sumac. So we're kind of excited to broaden our understanding of those other species as well. So overall, this data is used for adaptive management, site-by-site planning, early response and tracking noxious weeds, especially really bad ones like purple loosestrife, for example, and also tracking restoration progress using those defined metrics. So this might be interesting, but just kind of where sites are at as a whole is, let's see, 79% of sites have the tamarisk leaf beetle, and just to be clear, we don't release the beetle, we're just tracking it and seeing where it's at. Almost 70% of sites have more than 50% native vegetation cover, and most sites have Russian knapweed, which is a bummer, so that's why we're really prioritizing treating that. Only 7% of sites have over 50% total tamarisk cover relative to all vegetation, so that's really awesome news, especially compared to the very beginning of the partnership, and I think that's a really positive metric overall. So I want to really briefly talk again about the importance of having this accessible database. There are tons of benefits to data sheets, in Excel or paper or something, but Ark Online is a huge aspect of monitoring and makes it really successful and also useful. It's really easy to share with partners and land managers. You can quickly compare years in one platform to see changes and display those all in one map rather than like pulling up multiple Excel sheets. So with these long-term partnerships, there's a lot of turnover also, and within our organizations, but also land management agencies. So this also really ensures that data isn't lost on personal computers. That's a very realistic thing. Also, the ability to connect with Art Collector is so helpful, and it's not always 100% intuitive, but it's really central to the success of this program. So just some quick lessons learned is, make sure you're gathering data that's useful. That might sound obvious, but I think it's easy to just get excited about all the data you can be getting, but when you're talking about such a large area, that's not always feasible. Of course, the cost of the program and who's doing it and the sustainability of funding, it's always hard to find funding for monitoring, and huge thanks to the Walton Family Foundation for funding a lot of the work on the Dolores and playing an active role in making sure that it's useful. We've really appreciated their support in that aspect. Make sure data and reports are shared broadly and put in the database. Just, get it out there, and other people are going to want to use it as well. Having clear objectives, like I would say having those laid out ecological objectives from the very beginning was really helpful to kind of keep consistency over the years. And then, of course, just making sure that it's useful for adaptive management, since every year something is different with the environment or with people, so having the ability to change is really helpful. I think something that was good about this program is that it was so scalable. We went from 40 sites to like 300 sites, and that's really important, and it's still able to do it, within a good time frame of 1 to 3 years. So as the DRRP continues to work, monitoring still needs to occur on a regular and consistent basis. So obviously cost effectiveness is really part of it, but making sure that it's we're still tracking everything that we've been doing. It's important to consider education and training benefits. So who's doing this? Is it students or conservation corps crews? And it's valuable training for them that has always been fun to see folks get really into. You know, how long does it take to train them? If it's really involved program, it might not be very feasible to train folks in time. Another thing that I think is really important is having these solidified sites and polygons. So, you know, even over 10 years, we're still able to point back to the same sites and site names and site polygons, so we're always aware of what area we're talking about, which can be hard to establish up front, but especially when it's like all BLM lands, but that's really important. And then again, just the importance of that ArcGIS as a platform to house data, or maybe there's comparable platforms as well. And then, so coming soon, I've been working on this story map so folks can like really interact with this data. So hopefully next week we'll make a plan and send it out via email so folks can have a link to this. But we put a lot of this monitoring data in an Esri story map. So you should be able to zoom in and click on all of the monitoring areas and actually look at the data that we have, and also treatment data, photo points, and just other invasive species inventory. So we're really excited about that. You know, you can't really download and stuff on here, but I think it'll be a good way for folks to really actually look at that data, and it's really, you know, intuitive. There's also some other stuff on there like land ownership, habitat, geopolitical boundaries, things like that. So we're hoping this can be a good resource for folks. And that is all I have today. Yeah, I want to really thank all the DRRP partners. It's been an honor to work with everyone, and it's so fun to work on the Dolores. It's such a special place. And also thanks to all the coworkers for getting this together. And yeah, let us know if there are any questions. Rusty's going to help me field some at the end here. Oh, Rusty, I think you're on mute.
I'm talking away here. Okay. Well, Rica, thank you so much. Great presentation. Lots of facets that go into a public-private partnership like this. Of course, the monitoring is one kind of important and large piece, but you know, just one aspect of a partnership. And I second what Rica said. We'd love to thank all of our partners that have made this happen in Colorado and Utah and at the local and state level, and all the NGOs out there. We couldn't do all this work without the collaboration. So, well, moving on to questions. Again, I want to remind you, if you do have questions, click on the little bubble in the top right corner of your screen and you can type those in. Rica, we have a couple to kick off. Sally asks if there has been bird monitoring along the Dolores. Could you talk a little bit about the avian monitoring that has been done?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies has done a fair amount of monitoring on the Dolores. I know they did a lot on the Utah side in 2013, 15, and 17, and then on the Colorado side and 2016, 17, and 18. So we're still working with them too to see if they can come up with a habitat assessment analysis that we can plug into some of our revegetation efforts to see if we can really, you know, think about birds specifically and specific species when we are, you know, planting trees or doing stuff in the future, so that it has multiple habitat benefits.
Great. And early on, we did want to monitor, you know, like bird species, the impacts of some of the restoration that had on some of these species, whether it be positive or negative. And so we're continuing to progress and to locate funding for continued avian monitoring. I think we're going to continue that. Is that correct, Rica?
Yes, it's funding dependent, but we're feeling positive about it.
Okay. All right. Next, Rachel asked about the determination of Phragmites on the Dolores, whether it's native or invasive. I know that we did take some samples, genetic samples from the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and send those off. I know there's native Phragmites there. Is there invasive Phragmites along the Dolores as well, Rica?
We've seen some, I think, on the San Miguel, one time with Ken with the Uncompahgre field office, and I'm not sure if it's made it down into the Dolores. I wouldn't be surprised, but I haven't heard for sure. I'll look into that and ask him.
Okay. We do have in Mesa County, we do have both native and invasive Phragmites. So that's just one county along the Dolores, and I'm not entirely certain if that's specific along the Dolores, but we do have both invasive and native over here, kind of on the Utah border. So just so you know. Let's see. Another question here: has the entire riparian corridor been treated in some manner, one way or another, or are there still sites untouched that we will follow up on? Will you describe the 50-50 treatment technique and the rationale for it? I'll just take a quick stab and maybe turn it over to Rica. So not 100% of the riparian corridor has been treated for several reasons. A couple being, one, there are private landowners who have, who have decided not to participate in doing restoration along the riparian corridor. And early on, we wanted to respect private landowners' rights and their decisions not to do restoration. Some of them are just kind of letting the tamarisk beetle do its thing to control species like tamarisk. Others, there are some other difficult areas, such as very, very remote sites upstream from Moab and in the Dolores River Wilderness Study Area. So those are very inaccessible sites that early on we didn't treat, but we're looking to do some treatment on those, hopefully in the future. Rica, do you have anything to add on treatment sites along the river?
No, that was a good overview. Yeah, we've been putting some efforts into the wilderness study area. Last year we had a pilot project where we horse packed some crews up to where LaSalle Creek comes in to see the feasibility and just cost of doing that. So we're moving forward with that initiative, so that's kind of exciting. And then in terms of the 50-50 treatments, there's definitely a lot of value in just doing, maybe not clear cutting all the tamarisk, because that's pretty disruptive. It disturbs the understory and also is not always the best for birds. So kind of a patchwork or a 50-50 approach has been something the partnership looks at, especially more recently, to make it a little bit less intense on areas when we do removal.
Yeah. There is some other specific reasons for the 50-50 treatment. Is one, since the Dolores is in a very arid area, if you clear cut the tamarisk, it does expose the soil to direct sunlight, and it underneath at least the canopy of tamarisk, it does create microclimates that if you put plantings in some of those microclimates, they do a little bit better because there's some humidity. They're not exposed to direct sunlight, and so that's the other reason is sometimes the 50-50 treatment does allow for young plantings to get established, and when we can get those restoration sites established, then we can continue to remove the tamarisk canopy in following years. So there is some actual microclimate, humidity, and re-veg reasons why we don't clear cut all the time everywhere using those techniques. So Rose said, curious about the soil. I heard salt cedar increases soil salinity of the surface soil. I'm wondering if there's a fire, if there is a fire, if that helps with then replanting native species. They maybe. I'll let Rica take a shot at this. It does affect soil salinity, and we do know that if we burn large amounts of tamarisk in piles, that there can be some salt loading in the soil as well as a result of the fire. So, Rose, I guess one way I would state it is, I'm not sure if fire would help with the soil salinity aspect of it. Tamarisk is very, very fire adapted, meaning if a fire came through a tamarisk stand, they're very fire adapted. They'll come back bigger and stronger and and multiple stems. But you know, we have done soil amendments to help with reestablishing certain seed in certain areas that that we've deemed the soil too salty to or too high salinity to get established. So it really depends on, I think, the groundwater and the inundation of surface water on some of that soil, depending on how salty it gets. So, Rica, do you have anything on that?
Not really. That pretty much covers it. I mean, tamarisk have such large root systems that pull salt from you know, further down, and then as their leaves fall, it litters into the soil, really increasing that. So especially on the Dolores, where salt is already a really naturally occurring, you know, some would say problem, but you know, over down in bedrock. So it's definitely a tricky one. I mean, tamarisk come back so fast after fire that it's hard to say for sure, but who knows? There's a lot of research that could be done in that regard.
Great. Dave Holbrook said, with 2019 having a large release from McPhee Dam, have there been any notable observations, hypothesis of increased water? Rica, do you want to?
Yeah, so yeah, last year was a great water year, and we had done some, well, the partnership had done some plantings the fall prior to that, and that really helped those do really well, actually, by the bedrock boat ramp. We went and looked at them, and most of the cottonwoods are doing pretty well, and we presume it's because of that influx in water. Those little flows do a lot for shallow groundwater connectivity, and which does help those cottonwoods. It's hard to say for sure. There's a lot of folks with Fort Lewis College that have done good research in that regard, but it definitely helped a lot of our plantings, and especially down on the Utah side, we see some sites that are doing really well and having some good passive recruitment. So yeah, there's constant studies that can be done there, but that was definitely a good year for vegetation.
Okay. These next two questions are how students can get involved. How can someone like recent college grad or current college student get involved with their work? Are the paid monitoring positions hired through the Southwestern Conservation Corps? And then the next question is, you know, there's also interest, someone else is interested in how to get connected to this work. So yes, many of our positions with the conservation or with the DRRP are through conservation corps, through Southwest Conservation Corps out of Durango and Western Colorado Conservation Corps out of Grand Junction, and then Canyon Country Youth Corps out of Monticello, Utah. And those are paid positions. They also give AmeriCorps stipends to people who work with youth corps that can either be used to go to college or pay student loan debt. And so those are a good way to connect. Rica, I don't know if maybe the water centers at Colorado Mesa University or the Four Corners Water Center, if that's, you know, an option for students to connect on this work. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say you know, I'm happy to connect college students with professors who I know are doing this work, or yes, definitely just the water centers. Gigi Richard and Hannah Holm can certainly connect folks, students as well, with professors who are doing that work. And yeah, there's some awesome professors who I work with a fair amount who I know like getting students engaged, and there's certainly opportunities there.
There's another question about Phragmites and hybridization. Paula asks, when you have both types, have you found any hybridization of Phragmites occurring in Mesa County, and do you use glyphosate to treat on non-native Phragmites sites? From what I understand, and again, maybe Rica can help with this, that there is, I believe, the possibility of hybridization between the native and the non-native, and I think that's part of the story why the Phragmites is such a complex and difficult situation to identify, but just vision-wise. And so there are a number of organizations that are doing the genetic testing on those. I actually am I'm not entirely sure what the best herbicide use on Phragmites is, but Paula, we definitely have a lot of connections with weed supervisors that do a lot of herbicide treatments, and we can actually get you a response back on that. And Rica, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Hi, yeah, I'm not an expert. I see that Ken is saying here that they do hybridize, and it's very likely on the San Miguel. So yeah, it's not something that we've really treated so far. I mean, if it really blows up, that's something we could consider. And I'll certainly look into that a little bit more to find some resources that explains where that's happening and how that's happening.
And we rely heavily on a lot of county weed supervisors for some of their suggestions on how to treat, what's the proper use of herbicide on certain species. The Colorado Department of Agriculture is a great resource as well. I know other states have comparable and like agencies that can give guidance on those as well. So. Rica, I think that is it for questions. If there are no other questions, I think as we heard today, the DRRP is just a great example of a confluence of a program that really marries the restoration and riparian restoration that we do with education programs, social aspects, recreational aspects. And the DRRP is just one of those programs that we support, and that we use our membership funding and our donor funding to support these projects. And if you would like to support any of these projects like the Dolores or one of our other many projects, go to riversedgewest.org, www.riversedgewest.org, and click on Get Involved, and you can learn more about our membership and donor program. Those fundings go directly back into these riparian restoration projects and our educational projects, and we couldn't do it without those supporters. So again, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us. And stay tuned, we'll have more webinars to come. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.